Okay, Frau Meiritz, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for joining, everyone. I heard it's fantastic weather in Germany. Here it's a thunderstorm, so for me it's not a problem to be here with you. And this morning, or it's already noon over here, is already overlaid by so many topics. I just told my friends and colleague that President Biden has to undergo a root channel surgery. So we are all kind of waiting. So he had to postpone his actually scheduled meeting with NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg today. He had to postpone it to tomorrow. And as you're all aware, we are in a presidential election campaign. So every little detail of President Biden's health is actually is actually of a huge public interest. So that's why I'm having, like, with an eye, I have a I follow the news whether we hear anything from this. But with all those things happening every day, with news cycles, and my job, my business is news, through all that daily noise, I think it's sometimes quite easy to suppress the thought of an ongoing war in Europe. And even if it influences pretty much every major development all over the world right now. Let me be transparent here. I'm not an expert on, I'm not even an economist. I'm not a security expert. I'm not a war expert. But my strength as a correspondent and the strength of my paper Handelsblatt is that we always connect the dots. And the multiple crises we saw over the last years, the pandemic, the supply chain disruptions, the inflation, the war in Ukraine. So both the political and economic implications are less and less easy to separate from each other, because somehow everything, all of that is connected, right? And my privilege of my job in Washington is that I constantly talk to people and travel through the country, and those people know everything. So I try to share a little bit with that knowledge from my US perspective, but I would be very happy if you, in the end of this little lecture, would share your input with me or your questions, because I think we cannot explain the world in 60 minutes, but we can kind of try together to gather some input as an attempt to give some food for thought, I would say. So I will, this is my very, I'm a digital native, but sometimes it doesn't work. So I hope you can already see this little presentation I prepared for you.
Yes.
And
We see.
And I kind of prepared 3 takeaways I would like to guide you through in the next, let's say, 20-ish, 25 minutes. And the first one would be the economic implications of this war. Experts already are talking about a lost decade on growth. The second one would be the geopolitical shifts. And the third point or takeaway would be more from the US perspective. What is actually the US strategy in this war? So when we start with a big picture, when we look on the entire global economy, we certainly have to still emphasize that the whole world still feels the effects of a slower growth and faster inflation. One reason is that Russia and the Ukraine, not the Ukraine, that is Russia and Ukraine are major commodities producers. And disruptions through the war have caused global prices to soar, especially for oil and natural gas. But we also see that with wheat and agriculture products. Last week, we saw the major dam breaking, and this already let the prices for wheat spike again. So this war still has an ongoing effect on pretty much everything. Food costs have jumped, and let's keep in mind, Ukraine and Russia make up 30% of global exports in this sector, reaching a record. So increased geopolitical tensions further raises the risk of economic fragmentation. Also for trade deals, for example, we see the trend to just very limited minor trade deals. And one reason for that are also those multiple crises from the recent years. So let's get in a few numbers, not too many though, so I won't overload you with too many statistics. But within the last month, like pretty much every major economic institution put out warnings. Last week's the OECD forecasted a 2.7 global growth this year and only a modest pickup to 2.9% next year. And this is below the 3.4 average in the 7 years before the pandemic, meaning the global economy is facing its weakest growth since 1990. That is what the IMF is warning. And the World Bank, the sister organization, is warning of a lost decade for the global economy. And I think that captures quite intensely what we are talking about, a lost decade. What does it even mean? That the advanced economies, but also developing countries who accumulate a lot of debt right now, they cannot really gain momentum again, which is a huge problem. And so, of course, it is due to multiple reasons. We have still the aftermath of the pandemic, the Ukraine war, supply chain bottlenecks, very stubborn inflation, even if it goes down a little bit, in combination with that, tight interest rate policies, high debt levels, and sometimes instabilities in the banking system. So those are the factors who, that come together. And this is when I talk to economists, they say we had the Trump era when we had tariffs, and back then, like 5 years ago, there was the biggest problem that the US will impose tariffs on countries like on European countries, for example. And then back then, the biggest problem was the conflict between the US and China. And now we have a situation where there are multiple crises on top of this already existing problems. And that is something that really concerns economists all over the world. We see here, this this chart looks a little bit squeezed, but I think you can still, the main takeaway is you see the pink and you see the black, and the pink means the average growth for the global growth in the years before the pandemic. And you see that wherever we look, we don't get to those levels anymore. We can later discuss if this is actually, if growth is the only factor we should look onto it, because obviously some people say we should say goodbye to this classic, global output growth. We should factor in other important things for society, but I won't get too deep into it because we have a lot of things to discuss again. Let me allow one thing adding to Europe, because in Europe it's very interesting that Europe is in a double pressure situation. On the one hand, as you know better than me, they must replace, or they already did, Russian energy with more reliable supplies. And on the other hand, parts of Europe are trying to de-risk themselves from trade relationships with China. So they are in a double challenge right now. And when I talked to IMF Deputy Managing Director Geeta Gopinath a few weeks ago, I did an interview with her, and I asked her, do you see Europe out of the woods yet? And she said, no, totally not. Europe did a great job, especially Germany, when it came to energy diversification. But however, the risk of price increases, especially in the energy sector, remains for next winter. So I think, and she thinks, Europe and especially Germany, when it comes to price hikes and energy supply, is not out of the woods yet. And of course, in that context, we have to look to Eastern Europe as well, because right now they take the biggest toll of inflation and energy price hikes. So this can be an instabilizing factor as well, we see here. The one interesting thing we discussed within the last month is that Russia actually is still growing when you look on the economy. The Russian economy is actually still growing at a low level, yes. But the reason, or one of the reasons, is that the country's export revenues have been pretty resilient. They circumvent sanctions. India and China have snapped up the vast majority of Russian oil so far. And that means the Kremlin is enjoying stronger revenues for now. The IMF and other institutes say this is going to change quickly. Compared to that, Ukraine's economy pretty much has collapsed, and much of the country's capital stock has been destroyed, and poverty is on the rise, as you would expect from a country in war. And I had a very interesting interview with Anna Bierde. A few months ago, she was the managing director of the World Bank. She has a different role now, and she said, and I kind of can't forget this. The words she used. She said, Ukraine is a warning for the whole world. A country that was doing well economically, had stable institutions, and was driving reforms, was suddenly hit by this terrible war. So Ukraine has made us all realize that nothing is safe. And this feeling, or this fact, nothing is safe, from my point of view, or from my perspective, kind of transforms through many developments, geopolitical, economically, globally, around the world. And we have to keep that in mind. One more aspect in that context is worth mentioning, the Ukraine finance gap. We all know that Ukraine is dependent on massive transfers from other countries, mainly from Western countries. And so Kiev totally relies on transfers for everything, for economic recovery, for pretty much everything. But we have to keep in mind all the big money donation programs calculate that the war could end by mid-2024, which would be in about a year from now. And they do their financial calculations according to that. So right now, there's not really a financial scenario for what's going to happen afterwards, if this war might keep on going. And if this continues longer, new financing gaps are likely to open up. This is what all experts are saying on that. For example, the World Bank estimates that 411 billion are needed to rebuild Ukraine. To put that in comparison, this is more than 2.5 times of Ukraine's gross domestic product before the war. So this is a huge amount of money, and they expect this demand, this huge amount of money that is needed to keep this country safe, going, and potentially rebuild it at a certain point. This demand and this sum will go up, will go higher. How the US is doing in all of that, we will definitely take a look into when I'm starting the next point, when we try to talk a little bit, or I would like to try to give you some input on the more geopolitical shifts. Of course, this is connected to the economy, but both things are, they have their own, they have their own importance. Sometimes I have the debate with my readers and my editor whether we can actually talk of winners and losers of this war, because this might sound very cynical, right? In the war, there are only losers. But I think it's important to talk about the different consequences that this war has all over the world, and that there are indeed some, I really put that in quote, positive developments for some countries. And so first of all, of course, a super negative thing and a scary thing is that many experts already say we see a Cold War reloaded. I'm going to quote Tracy German. She's a professor of conflict and security at King's College in London. And she says this conflict has widened the rift between the US-led liberal international order on one side, and on the other side, an angry Russia and emboldened rising superpower China on the other hand. So this world is now divided in two camps, and new alliances are shaped all over the world. As a fact, we can point out that this conflict definitely has sparked a new arms race, first from Russia itself, but also the US has ramped up weapons production quite a lot. France and Germany do have efforts to boost military spending. And this is something for a long time we thought would go in exactly the other direction, right? And now we have this development again. If there's something like a positive note, it's that it's certainly the strength of NATO in this context. So the Western military alliance stands strong, very strong, and is growing. Not just in the support for Ukraine, but they are, they had to. Some experts even say they found their new world power purpose. They kind of proved that they are strong when it's necessary. We see that it's growing. Finland and Sweden asked to join NATO as protection against Russia. And in this, we will have the NATO summit coming up in about 4 weeks in Vilnius. And I would encourage you to look, we have all these big stories about the 2% goal and who's going to deliver which weapons and fighter jets and yes or no. But I would encourage you to look a little bit, to read a little bit between the lines and actually look what role the Eastern European states will play in that and already do play in that. Because from the US perspective, Eastern Europe, especially Poland, is getting much more influential on a global stage and in transatlantic relations. We see that, for example, with Biden, the president for whom Poland actually was not high on the priority list at the beginning of his term. He actually said that on one of the background briefing calls. And then he visited Poland twice after the war broke out. So this is very, like, the US is looking to strengthen ties with Eastern Europe, because we kind of all know when this war is hopefully sooner than later over, Eastern Europe and Ukraine will be new hubs of defense, and they will be strategically very, very important. This will be a very important region to deter Russia from future wars, right? So I encourage you really to look at what Poland and other Eastern European countries are doing the next weeks and months coming. The war also shapes transatlantic relations on different levels. I had a very interesting interview with the director of the Center for Europe and Eurasia last month at the Hudson Institute. He's Peter Ruff. He's very, very smart. And he connects the dots when I'm not able to do it. He does it. And I'm quoting him. He said, "The Ukraine war demonstrates that there will be no strategic autonomy for Europe. The US leads the West because it has to." So in a sense, the war in Ukraine kind of brought a new realism that Germany has new nuclear weapons. It is not a nuclear superpower, and like the rest of Europe, lives in the shadow of nuclear power Russia. And for the US to keep up its leading role seems more crucial than ever in these times. On a side note, I found very interesting is that as Biden biographer Chris Whipple reconstructs in his book, 4 months before the war broke out, Biden actually warned Germany, France, Italy, and the British government against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He met them at the G20 summit in Roma. And there's a quote in this book from one of Biden's staffers, and they said, but nobody would listen to him. They found the idea of an invasion unbelievable. And it still strikes me that it took the US a while to convince its European partners there's actually a huge danger around the corner. Some readers, some Handelsblatt readers sometimes write me whether the US can be considered to be, kind of a winner or a profiter of this war. And I address this question because I think it's important to talk about that. Let me be clear here. The US, no one in the US wants this war, and especially not in the Biden administration. There's no strategy behind that the US would benefit from it somehow. But at the same time, there are some facts out there that needs to be addressed, that raising energy prices in Europe make Europe less attractive for investors, right? And make the US more attractive. And what is a fact is that LNG exports are booming because Europe had to diversify its energy supply. But still, I would still, dampen that down a little bit, that supply chain issues and inflation is a big problem for the US. So it's not that the US is kind of the super economic winner right now. There are still warnings of a recession. So it's a mixed bag economically for the US. And let's not forget that there's the risk right now of weakening the dollar as a global currency. As we see, there is a backlash brewing against the dominance of the dollar. And this is also part of the mixed bag of this geopolitical developments during the Ukraine war. Speaking of backlash here, the war, of course, also shapes relations between the superpowers USA and China. First of all, because Russia has strengthened economic ties with China to circumvent the sanctions. And second, there are huge fears in the US that China is going to see the war in Ukraine as encouragement for China to reclaim Taiwan by force. So this Taiwan question is looming about every political debate right now here. And so many senators and congressmen, congresswomen on the Hill warn, if Putin is successful in conquering Ukraine, the next thing that is going to happen is that China is going to, trying to reclaim Taiwan. Obviously, geopolitical tensions are not that easy, but we have to keep this question in mind when we try to explain the US strategic in the war in Ukraine. They have China in their mind all the time when it comes to Ukraine aid, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, when it comes to inviting Zelensky to the White House. It's always also a signal towards China. There is never not a China factor into that. And I also encourage you again to, when you see a press conference of Biden or something happening in the US, that to always factor the China factor in, so to speak, right? So bottom line here is that it's a kind of a dangerous, sensitive mix. On the one hand, we have Beijing and Moscow getting closer during the Ukraine war. For example, China imports goods from Russia that are banned elsewhere due to Western sanctions. And all this is happening in an already tense geopolitical climate where the US wants to distance itself from China anyway, to move supply chains back to the US and all that. And on top of that, all this is happening with Europe and Germany being sort of in the middle of that and very close to the war. So I would say that China's role in the Ukraine war is increasing the pressure on Europe and Germany to be closer to the US approach and to be less close with China. So very complicated, intense times we live in. One example for that, I don't know who of you listened to a speech Jake Sullivan gave a few weeks ago. Jake Sullivan is the national security advisor of President Joe Biden. And it was a very interesting speech on the international economic strategy of the US. And what struck me the most was that he put China and Russia on one level at a certain point. So he was talking about the concept of economic integration, for example, through the World Trade Organization, right, who try to put all the same rules, global trade, global economy, for every country who's joining that. And he said this concept of economic integration has failed. And then he said, he literally put China on one level with Russia, and I'm quoting him here. China was not prevented from expanding its military ambitions, and Russia was not prevented from invading its neighbor. So neither country became more responsible. And for me, there was it's just a huge shift we are witnessing here, right? This is a huge strategic shift of a Western power we witness here right now. And it also has to do with the war in Ukraine. Not solely, not purely, but it is something to do with it, absolutely. Last but not least, we cannot forget the role of the global South. I will keep this super short because this is so complex. We could read like 10 books about it right now. But we should not lose out of sight what the countries South Africa, Brazil, India, and China, the BRICS countries, how they behave and how they develop right now in those global uncertain times. And some experts I talk to, they see the BRICS countries as a new powerhouse who push their influence in uncertain geopolitical times, and they kind of try to provide an alternative or an alternative model to the West, like the G7. One example is that Russia is selling more of its energy to India and China, as I mentioned before. And another example is that none of those countries you see here, except of Russia, of course, is that none of them are taking part in the sanctions against Russia. So there is already a gap. The third point, and that will be the final point I'm making, I know it's a lot of input and numbers and facts, but because this war is so complicated and so complex, but I think we can, when I'm finished, we can kind of peel off one layer after the other and try to find, I don't know, like a main takeaway for every one of us. But before we go there, I would like to point out a couple of things, facts, developments here in the US where I'm in Washington. Let me show you 3 charts first. I found them very interesting. So you see here the United States, they are the main pillar for Ukrainian defense, right? The United States give by far the most money for Ukraine to defending itself. This is always worth to remember when we have a debate about Ukraine aid. Then we also, at the same time, we see this is not a US project or this is not a European project. This is a project it's pretty much all over the world. Like 47 countries have provided military aid to Ukraine. So I mentioned before, this war is shaping alliances, and this war is shaping like kind of a global alliances, who's willing to defend Ukraine and who's not. And this figure struck me the most. In the US, we certainly have a debate about, probably like in Europe as well, are we spending too much money on Ukraine? Are we sending too many weapons? When is this supposed to end? But actually, when you compare other spending in the US, it's not that much. It's less than the state of Virginia. Like one US state is spending in its entire budget for a whole year. So it's worth keeping in mind that, to put it in the relation, it's a lot of money, but at the same time, it's not that it takes away a lot of money from other spending. One thing I would like to mention when it comes to Biden, I talked to his biographer, Chris Whipple, whom I mentioned before, and he said the war in Ukraine actually influenced Biden's decision to run for re-election. So, and I found this really, really interesting. So in his book, the book is called Fight for His Life, and it's kind of the first memoir of Joe Biden's presidency. And in this book, the author describes a president who considers himself difficult to replace. Biden obviously thinks that, especially at a time where everything depends on transatlantic success, he is necessary, like the world needs him, right? And we can debate about that, whether that's true or not, but that's how Biden sees his role right now on geopolitical stage. And according to Chris Whipple, his biographer, it was the war that prompted Biden to consider a second term at the age of 80. Quote, Joe Biden, the transatlanticist, saw himself uniquely qualified to defend Ukraine, defy Putin, and rally NATO partners around him. But they are certainly different strategic goals that are beyond the person Joe Biden. I saw the president last week at the White House when he was standing next to British Prime Sunak. And Biden was asked, hey, how do you handle the growing resistance against the Ukraine aid? And he said, the fact of the matter is, I asked people to picture what would happen if we were not supporting Ukraine, right? Do we think Russia would just stop? Do you think that's all that would be happening? I think not. And this is the thing he tries to communicate. And interesting here is that Biden increasingly starts to address the need for ongoing funding for Ukraine, something he simply didn't have to do for a long time. Biden is not very good in explaining why he's supporting Ukraine. Like when it comes to public appearances. He's talking a lot about infrastructure and China and to re-industrialize the US, but he's very rarely talking about Ukraine. And I think we are seeing a development right now that he has to explain more to the American people why he's doing what he's doing and why it's important that after the presidential elections 2024, it's important that the support for Ukraine is going on. And keep in mind, the flow of money from Washington could be in jeopardy as early as the summer. So the White House could ask for a new Ukraine spending package very soon. And as we all know, there is some resistance from some Republicans. But it's still the case, it's not at all the majority of Republicans and Democrats. The isolationists, the so-called, are in the minority in both parties. But I would say the Ukraine aids are an increasingly fragile construct, nevertheless, because we simply don't know how long the support is going to last. And yeah, so and even without the debate about money, the US strategy is full of problems and is very, very difficult. The US government is pursuing what it calls a strategy of containment. That means, on the one hand, they want to limit the war in Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from falling to Russia, hence the massive military support. On the other hand, the US does not want a direct conflict between Russia and the West. So the US is not supplying appropriate systems, military systems, to enable Ukraine to retake all of its territory, including Crimea. For example, long-range missiles, fighter jets, they don't do that. They don't want to cross that red line yet. And this strategy of containment is, when I talk to experts, they say it's an almost impossible balance the longer the war takes on. The experts said at a certain point, you have to decide what are you going to do. One last point when we talk about strategies, where does the US stand on peace talks? So when I talk to government officials, they see it as very unrealistic at the moment. They see it as impossible to act against the interests of Zelensky and to urge him to give up territory. So for now, the US government's goal is to put Ukraine in a strong negotiating position whenever those talks and under whatever circumstances they occur. Bottom line, and then I will be finished, the longer the Ukraine war continues, the more the Ukraine aid could be up for debate. I'm going to quote Charles Kupchan here. He's the former European director at the White House National Security Council under Barack Obama. And he told me in an interview, we cannot assume that Western support will continue at current levels. We have to be prepared for the current support to diminish over time, meaning that the Western unity will come under more and more pressure the longer this conflict grinds on, probably on both sides of the Atlantic. So we covered a lot of ground here.
Well, thank you very much for this, for showing us how complex the situation is and from how many perspectives you can look at the problem. Thanks for this attempt, or for this successful attempt at structuring all this. And while I'm talking, I might as well ask you a quick question. Let me take you up on this last item of your talk about the waning support for Ukraine support, especially among the Republicans. What can Europe do to influence America not to decrease the support?
That's a very good and smart question.
If we get a Republican president and he says, well, no more support, and then what do we do?
For now, I think I think it's very important to keep in mind that this could very well happen, that we will have a Republican president in 2024 or 2025 when the inauguration is. Not every Republican presidential candidate wants to pull out the Ukraine aid, right? We have Nikki Haley, we have Mike Pence, and I think Tim Scott. Those are the three pro-Ukrainian presidential candidates on the Republican field. But of course, we have Donald Trump, who's still leading the field, who says, I'm going to end this war in 24 hours, and I'm going to pull out all the aid. It is a very good question, because here in the US, whenever I talk to government officials and on the Hill to people, they are very impressed what Europe has done when it comes to energy diversification, when it comes to showing unity. We all know that there are differences within the EU and within the NATO when it comes to handling this war, but overall, the unity was quite strong. So for now, there is not that much convincing necessary, because the US or the Biden administration sees what the European side has already done, and they are just glad that this transatlantic ties are strong. But sometimes I talk to experts who say we have to prepare for a plan B. We have to prepare for an alternative scenario in case Biden is not going to win re-election, or what are we going to do then? So to answer your question, I think for now, the isolationists, it's hard to pronounce this word, Isolationisten in German, they are still in a minority. And I think this is not going to change as soon as the public support is quite strong. And so far, we don't see a sign that this public support is eroding. It slows down a little bit, but it's not kind of breaking in. And I think this is important when we talk about Biden himself. He needs to ramp up his political speeches when it comes to Ukraine. It's his job to convince the Americans, not ours, so to speak.
Yeah. I hope it's not too much of a toothache for Biden, just to allude to what's going on right now. Yeah, but anyway, thank you very much. In view of the numbers here, we're nearly 30 people here in the audience. If you would like to ask a question, best thing would be to raise your hand, and so to keep this in a structured manner. Please go ahead and raise your hand for a question or a commentary, whatever.
I know that no one wants to be the first.
Yeah.
I totally understand. I feel you. And please don't be overwhelmed by that I kind of try to put everything in 30 minutes. Like I'm happy to learn and that we share information or views. I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me a little bit how the support is in Europe and in European countries right now for the Ukraine aid. Like, are people still supportive? Or is there development too? I don't know really much about.
Well, I hope there is an answer from the audience. I mean, I don't want to monopolize this evening. I mean, there is support, but I think, as you said, same as in America, the longer the war goes on, the more difficult it gets to justify further financial and military aid. But what struck me was that a few weeks ago, our president went to Ukraine with a delegation of German industrialists or representatives of the German industry. And it struck me that they are already waiting to get the necessary orders after the war. And the next question would be, where would the money come from? You mentioned a staggering sum of several $100 billion. Where would the money come from? I mean, that can't be paid by the Ukraine. There must be a second Marshall Plan or something like that.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned. Did Ursula von der Leyen go there, or who? Sorry, I didn't get the first, but did who?
Yeah, Steinmeier went there.
Oh, Steinmeier went there.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
and a group of industrialists.
This is the reason why I'm so excited about this is I'm just working on a story, and this is so significant because this is the main question. So the US, some US officials, they already tried to change the narrative of Ukraine away from this is a country in war to this is a country with very lucrative perspectives. And this is already happening. So one contact told me when he's in the train towards Eastern Europe, it's full of lobbyists right now from the defense industry and from other talk about investing, for example, rare earth.
We are having,
we're
experiencing some difficulties, some sound problems.
Oh, okay.
But now you're back. Now you seem to be back. Yeah.
Okay. So I make it short. The question is, the US is actively trying right now to get private investors on board. So the World Bank and the IMF, for example, who have this huge support programs, they are actively reaching out to private investors and say, look, if you invest in Ukraine, it's not just a country in war, it is a country with a actual with a business perspective for you. And this is already happening. So this is very interesting information for me that this is happening. Or earth material wise, defense industry wise, that there will be many angles where you can look onto.
Yeah, I can see the rationale behind this. I mean, it's a lost decade, and we're going to make up for it by investing in Ukraine, in the rebuilding and restructuring of Ukraine.
Yeah, it still sounds political, but it is. It is. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience, please? Don't hesitate. Raise your hand or just speak. Just speak out.
But no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah. Oh, David, you raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruno, and thank you, Annett, for your presentation and the insights from Washington into U.S. trade policy and global economics. I think that was really a treat, and thank you very much for it. You also mentioned at the end of your remarks the presidential election campaign that is now underway, and we now know some candidates on both sides of the aisle, and you said that we have to take into account the possibility that a Republican president will be, or maybe could be inaugurated in January 2025. And you talked a little bit about the possibility or the impression in Washington when it comes to European commitment to Ukraine, helping Ukraine in its defense against the Russian aggression. But when we talk about a possible Republican president, then we talk about a decline in Ukraine support, because when we take a look at DeSantis or Trump, we can hear very similar arguments when it comes to helping Ukraine, or to decline this or to decrease this help. So do you hear some voices from Washington what Europe should do when the US maybe turns its way into a more isolationist view on global security policy? And there was a huge discussion in NATO when it comes to this infamous quote from former President Trump that NATO is obsolete. And so what can you say about, or what do you hear from experts in Washington when it comes to European commitment, European strategy, or new ways for European security?
I always value your input as well, because it's this NATO is obsolete. This is something we quoted 100 times, but somehow it's like already so far back in the past, and now it's very, very relevant again. So thank you for reminding me of that. So first of all, when we have German or European diplomats in general in Washington, they are very much aware, and they make a huge effort in connecting with the Republican Party and Republican think tanks, Republican senators, congressmen, congresswomen. This is a thing they learned from 2016, because no one wants to be surprised again. Everyone wants to be prepared, and I think that is the very, this is the only right thing to do. And so there is, like, in the background, there's already so much happening right now with meetings, and you know we had a couple of weeks ago in Florida, things like that are happening. So there are different scenarios here, and many experts from conservative or more left liberal institutes, they both share the same view that when the Ukraine aid might be at a stand to debate at a certain point, it won't be like that someone is going to push the button and then the Ukraine aid is gone. Like, it would be probably a partial, it would be a slow process. We have to keep in mind that the Ukraine aid is divided in military support, humanitarian support, and economic support. So, for example, paying the salaries of teachers in Ukraine. So this is all part of the economist support and humanitarian. So many experts say the military support will fall last. First of all, some isolationists will try to reduce the humanitarian and the so-called Wirtschaftshilfen for Ukraine. And that's the point where Europe probably would have to step up. So to make a plan B, how can we fill this gap in case this is going to happen? And the president, I mean, a Republican president is very, he can say yes or no to Ukraine aid, but there's still Congress, and there are still many Republicans who want to keep up those military spending for Ukraine. So it will be more like a long battle. And then at the same time, the pressure will probably increase that we kind of need a peace talk solution. So probably the pressure on Europe will increase to play a more active role on that, which will open new problems, as we all know, because you cannot just say, well, let's all go to the table right now and talk, because we know that, how to talk with someone like Russia who just invades a democratic neighbor, right? And then we have China, who has a so-called peace plan, which is not really a peace plan. So this is my take on that we won't see like U.S. engagement, and then the U.S. engagement will stop immediately, but we will likely see an erosion, and there's already a preparation for that happening in Europe, and an awareness that at a certain point financially one has to step up. Or, I mean, there is always a scenario that this war might end. Nothing is impossible. But for now, for all the American experts and politicians I talk to, this seems so far out of reach. It's really, really depressing. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but it's
no, but thank you. It was great, and a good reminder of the congressional way of decision making.
Okay, anyone else, please? Doesn't have to be a question, can be a simple contribution. I mean, my fear is that when the war grinds on, that many people ask themselves, how far are we prepared to go? And I think that this is my fear, that voices of the right will gain in power when it comes to elections. You know, when populists, when right-wing politicians capitalize on the sacrifices that the West is making. You know, you talked about the soaring prices. You talked about the diminishing trade deals and the lost decade, yeah, on growth. And I think this is what might be on the horizon, a rise of right-wing voices, populist voices, saying we need the money for something else, for our own infrastructure, you know, for our, in German, for our Wärmepumpen, you know. So what do you think? Do you see this? Or perhaps the audience? Do you have an opinion on this? Yes, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Good evening together. And first of all, thanks for your very short and brilliant explanation. And my questions belongs to Mr. Erdogan. Which kind of role can and will he play in the ongoing situation with the war? And what will be his position and interests?
In regard to the situation with, sorry, I just...
No, my question is, which kind of role will Mr. Erdogan play in the upcoming situation in the war, and what will be his interest and position in all these dilemma and the situation between Ukraine and Russia?
I wish I would have my colleague here right now, Ozan, who is like Ozan is our Istanbul correspondent, and he could answer this question. I would love to call him now, but it's very late.
Okay, good.
So it's
maybe I change. Can the position and the political leadership from Mr. Erdogan be getting stronger and for better standing in Europe and in his area?
I think it's an excellent question, and I'm very, very sorry that I cannot give that much.
It doesn't matter.
My specialty is more U.S. China, but it is very relevant for Europe. So that's why I totally get why you asked this question. And I always have to kind of focus on certain areas. And my thing is like U.S. China, U.S. Europe. So
everything is good. No, his country and his position to control the sea and the entrance and the doors to the Black Sea is very interesting. And he's leading all the discussion about the wheat program for the world, for the for food programs and so on. And his position in Europe and for the EU candidate is very, very weak. And I think nobody wants him.
This is so interesting. And you know what? I will take this to my editor, into my Istanbul correspondent, that we will have to give this more room, because you're absolutely right. He has a key holder position. This is absolutely right.
Yeah. And okay, we stop. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay.
Anyone else, please? Don't be shy. Go ahead. There is someone in the chat. Which role could Emmanuel Macron play when it comes to form a geopolitical Europe? This is from Robert.
Yeah, maybe Bruno, you can give a little bit more input because you have probably more the European side in, like, I can just add to that question, very good question as well, that from the US perspective, they very closely watch Macron right now, because what he said a few weeks ago after his visit to China, when he said we have to, within this conflict between US and China, we cannot get in the middle, Europe has to decide, and we cannot get dependent on US either. So he made his point very, very clear. And I think Macron plays a critical central role for the question for the whole European country, where are we going to stand? Right now we stand in the middle between the US and China, but this cannot go on because the pressure is increasing from both sides. And so this is the main thing the US is watching Macron right now. But within the EU, what he's doing right now in regard to the war in Ukraine, maybe Bruno, you want to add a little bit on that, if you want to.
I haven't got much to add to that. I mean, from what I know, the French have traditionally been comparatively neutral. I mean, they have always managed to keep a certain distance to the United States. You know, I mean, de Gaulle was the one who actually, as far as I could remember, actually threw NATO out of France for a time. You know? And I think this is Macron's problem, perhaps. Where does he position France? If he appears to be too close to the United States, he might lose the support in France, but he clearly can't position himself closer to China. You know? But it's a great opportunity for Germany and France to get closer together. You know? But this is my knowledge of this kind of this area is not very good. David, you again raised your hand.
Yeah, I just want to. I think there is a lot of Gaullism reflex in France when it comes to the US and its relations to NATO security policy, and especially when it comes to European security policy. But I want to shift the discussion maybe more to this to China and to the role China plays in the transatlantic relations. And we experienced a couple of acts in the last year, in the last a month, when it comes to the the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. And I think we can see that there is a more or less strategic way of decision making and, in fact, act making to use such acts in a, I would say, economic isolationist way when it comes to Europe and when it comes to China. For instance, this CHIPS Act. And do you think that when it comes to the transatlantic relation and this pressure from Washington to Europe with regard to China, that these acts are a kind of tool to negotiate in some ways with the European counterpart? Because I think the Inflation Reduction Act is, I talked to a lot of German entrepreneurs and people from German companies, and they are quite devastated when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, because they fear that they were thrown out of, or they will be thrown out of the US market on one way or the other. And on the other hand, they fear this CHIPS Act because the US uses it as a strategic tool to maybe diminish the Chinese potential, when it comes to chips and maybe Taiwan is another topic. But do you think that the U.S. government and and U.S. politics uses these acts to negotiate on a different level, negotiate with European capitals or the European Union as a whole? Your mic is off.
Yes, it's absolutely true. I recommend, like a few weeks ago, Handelsblatt had a huge cover story on Bidenomics, and it was a very nice cover with Joe Biden, and then you had his signature sunglasses, and in the sunglasses you could see like the reflection of some windmills, so like green energy. But this story was more than, oh, Joe Biden is reindustrializing his country. The story was more about how the US administration doesn't ask its partners like Europe, especially Germany, when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act or other substitutes they give to their industry. And the main goal, like this is Biden's main goal, is distancing the US economy from China. And he does it more than and quicker and more consequent than Donald Trump. So he's actually the more protectionist president than Donald Trump when it comes to China. So, and the effect on Europe in this is, so the relations are very friendly, but at the same time, one expert told me he indirectly puts all his partners and friends under pressure because the US just decides. They always say small yard, big fence. That's what the US is saying, meaning they take something like the chips industry and say, this is a small yard, the chips industry, but we put a big fence around it. No Chinese investors coming into our small yard. That not only affects the Chinese investors or the US investors, that affects European investors as well, who do invest in China. And if China retaliates, the European and German investors come in the middle of that. Next thing we will see this at the so-called outbound investment screenings. This is a very tough topic for a beautiful warm Monday summer night, but this will be the most significant change the Biden administration will impose. It's about if an investor invests in China, let's say in artificial intelligence, new technology, and he kind of has business ties to China, then in the future, US regulators will have to check these investments first because they give green light. That means there's no really freedom of intellectual property and investments anymore in those sectors. The Americans just decide that, and then Europe is under pressure to do a similar approach because they don't want to get in the crosshairs of all of this. So, long story short, the relations between Washington and Brussels are very, very good, but the US kind of decided we want to distance ourselves from China, and our friends either come with us or not. So either they have to do the same thing as we do, or if not, well, it's their loss. And this is how they put pressure on their partners. And it is very, very, here in Washington, they see that they were already successful with it. They said, well, in Germany and in Brussels and in other European countries, things are changing. They see China more critically. They want to distance themselves too, and that's partially because we urged them to do that. So this is certainly a very important goal of the Biden administration to achieve that, yes. Long answer.
Yeah. Anyone else? Herr Schmidt, there's a hand, Jürgen Schmidt. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to answer your question a couple of minutes before, because you said there is a problem with gaining power of the right-wing parties. And also, I want to direct to Annett Meiritz concerning the question of the support of the Ukraine in Germany. I did research on a level of a university, and I compared the students of economics with the students of social sciences. And normally, the students of social sciences prefer to elect left-wing parties, yeah, for example, Grüne or SPD. And I could, the result was that there were a major support also of these social sciences students for the delivery of the weapons for the Ukraine. And I think they typologize the situation like the situation of David and Goliath. So the Goliath, Russia invades the Ukraine is the David. And I think there is an alliance between the people which are very close to the classical strategy of deterrence strategy on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who are very close to the peace movement. And that's very strong, and that's a counterweight against this gain in power of the right-wing parties. You are right, there's a gain of power of the right-wing parties, but you have an alliance, at least in Germany, between the people who are very close to the deterrence strategy on one hand, and people who are normally very close to this peace movement. And that's a good base, a good counterweight to predict that there is a support for the delivery of weapons. I think so. That's a very important point for the forecast of power in Europe, I think, and in Germany.
Super interesting.
Yeah, that's.
I could just say that it's always important to have those. That is not just one societal development here. There are several parallel to each other, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Perhaps one more question from my side. I'm not quite sure about this. I think for a long time, Europe had not been on the minds of many Americans. I mean, under Obama, there was the Asian pitch. Asia was much more interesting for Americans. And now suddenly there is this European problem. I mean, there is Blinken, the Secretary of State, who grew up in Paris, and I'm sure he has a good understanding of the European situation. But what do you feel? How do you feel about the American impression, or the American, or the knowledge in the administration, in the administration cluster in Washington of Europe?
I think in the administration, the knowledge and the awareness is very, very high, because we have one of the most transatlanticist administrations when it comes to strategic and national security. But when you talk to people out of Washington, I just went to Iowa to the GOP presidential event, and it's not that everyone in Iowa sits there and says, well, it's a regional conflict, we should stop giving the money. It's not the case. It's more a little bit like indifference. It's a little bit like, oh, right, we still give money for them. Oh, the war's still going on, right? Like, it's a little bit, there are more pressing problems for the average American than debating about Ukraine aid or not. And it's simply, they are not as close. When we're talking about the nuclear threat, Germany is closer to Russia and to Ukraine. So in Iowa is very far away. So we always have to keep that in mind. But it's not like many Americans, on the other hand, are well aware what's going on, and the majority of the Americans still support that the US is giving a lot of money and spending a lot of military aid money on Ukraine. I'm not sure about how they really see the strategic goal behind this. And that's where I think Biden comes into play again, that he should connect the dots between China and Ukraine more when it comes to public experience. He should tell the people, guys, it's not just about Russia and Europe, it's about China as well. And then I think there will be a little bit more awareness. But in Washington itself, there is a lot of, I mean, most of Biden's leading stuff is from the Obama administration, and they kind of learned their lesson from Minsk II, from the negotiations about parts of Crimea, and they learned their lesson never to underestimate Russia again, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
That is a very pessimistic note to end. Yeah.
Well, if there is no other question, I would like to thank Annett Meiritz for giving us these insights, for structuring the complex situation. And I would also like, there's another question, and now you're now, Frau Weitz, you lifted your hand. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to thank, and I got the wrong symbol, I guess. I didn't want to raise my hand. I wanted to applaud.
You wanted to applaud. Yeah, we grateful. Well, I'm sure Frau Meiritz will gracefully accept it. Yeah.
I can hear it in Washington.
Yeah. There was another hand, perhaps that was also the wrong symbol. Yeah. But yes, if there are no other questions, thank you, Annett Meiritz, for doing this and for giving us your time and for structuring the problem. Yeah, some very interesting insights. Thank you very, very much. And thanks to the audience for coming on this hot Monday night. If you feel like coming again, take a look at our program, take a look at the program of the German-American Institute, take a look at the program of the Atlantische Akademie in Kaiserslautern. These are the partners, and there will be another meeting, if not two meetings, together with the Dalibor Study Center of the Miami, Ohio University in Luxembourg. Stephanie Shaheen, thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting all this. Well, so thank you. Have a good evening. Well, enjoy the rest of the summer night. Thank you very much for coming.
Bye, and thank you.